Hello, my name is Joe Kramer. I'm a high school physics teacher and a writer on OpenSciEd High School Physics 1. Lesson 6 is a jam-packed 3 days. We close the loop on thinking about energy transfer in our generator system, and we work with a beautiful simulation of particles inside wires. Students take their first official summative assessment of the unit, so I want to help you think about how to differentiate and prioritize within the lesson. Let's get started on looking at that. First, some details about how we got here from lesson 5. During the last lesson, we figured out changing fields cause energy to transfer in generators, and our model of these generators shows us that we still have questions about what's happening inside the wires. So we turn our attention to those wires. This is a investigation lesson that takes place over 3 days. It would take about 45 minutes of materials prep or less. The core investigation takes place on simulations using laptops, and you can do the lesson very effectively with mostly those laptops. If you choose to spend time on the real world version of this experiment done as a demonstration, that can add to the setup time. So it might end up being more like an hour if you do those real world experiments. I'll talk about this lesson in 3 chunks over the course of these 3 days. First, on day 1, we start with a close reading about changing fields, which includes making energy transfer diagrams to model passages from the reading. So we figure out that changing fields can help explain how particles transfer energy, and this gets us wondering what other models could help us understand what happens inside the wires. We work with a computer simulation showing particles inside those wires to find relationship between wire width and wire length and energy loss. There are other relationships, but these are the primary ones. We figure out that longer and thinner wires tend to lose more energy to the surroundings and carry less current. So this gets us wondering how these new takeaways could apply to electric grid design, and we turn to our engineering design tracker to make sense of that. Then finally, the motors transfer task is an opportunity to transfer our understanding of generators and wires to a slightly different context. So we figure out that our understanding of energy transfer in the generator helps us understand what's happening in a motor, that a motor is basically a generator run in reverse. So in summary, fields help explain interactions between particles like electrons, and particle motion helps explain energies lost to the surroundings. Longer wires and thinner wires cause more energy to be lost, but there are some trade-offs to using thicker or shorter wires that we need to think about. And motors are like generators run in reverse, so a lot of the same principles apply. Some key moments from these 3 lessons. This reading, called the Changing Fields reading, is somewhat dense. So the way we manage it is through a close reading that takes place in 3 parts. The third part involves energy modeling. So this gives us more practice with this modeling, and that helps us process what the reading actually says. For example, we see a couple important patterns like changing electric fields push electrons, which change electric fields, which push electrons, and so on and so forth. Another similar pattern that we see comes up again in Unit 5 about electromagnetic radiation. Changing electric fields cause changing magnetic fields, and changing magnetic fields cause changing electric fields, and so on and so forth. I urge you to go through this reading yourself and try modeling a few phrases. This will better help you support your students. The idea is not there is one correct model for each phrase. The idea is we want to get students thinking about how they can use these diagrams to show what they know. On day 2, we turn to a simulation of particles inside wires. We can change things like width and length and metal type and temperature of the wire, and we look at the effect this has on energy loss. So our focus is on finding relationships in the format that you see here at the bottom of your screen. For example, as wire length increases, percent energy loss increases. On day 3, we apply these ideas that we've figured out to grid design using the engineering design tracker. For example, we might say that it makes sense to build power plants close to where electricity will be used because longer wires lose more energy, but this would have adverse effects on people's health if the plants release pollution. So, other relationships will yield different applications, different trade offs. Essentially, we're practicing making connections between the conclusions we reach through experiments and the connections they have to real world applications. Then the bulk of day three is devoted to the motors transfer task. We introduce this task by actually connecting the generator you see here to a battery, and we see the handle spin, which helps us transition to thinking about this object that we're thinking of as a generator to thinking of it as a motor. That is, the same thing can be run as a motor if we attach it to an energy source. Depending on your context and your student population, this transfer task experience can vary widely. It can be very, very difficult for students to take one of these for the first time. There's a reference resource for teachers called Transfer Task Scaffold that contains suggestions on strategies to help students show their best work. Um, if they've never done one of these before, especially, it's worth investing in certain moves that will help the assessment experience feel more successful, more equitable, and ultimately more effective at telling you what students actually know. Where do we go from here? In lesson 7, we try to put the pieces together to explain what actually did happen in Texas and why some people lost power, why some people were affected differently than others. Some tips and tricks about how to use materials here. Um, Modeling passages from the changing fields reading is great practice for the motors transfer task. Students are given a rubric to give each other feedback on each other's models, and looking at each other's work and using the rubric on their own work can be very important practice for that task, and also just for making sense of energy transfer. I'm always on the lookout for opportunities to do what we'd call whiteboarding, to circle up with big whiteboards so students can see each other's work and give feedback. This is one of those opportunities. So, in general, I would encourage you to consider what scaffolds may help your students work through this modeling task. With ninth graders, for example, I created a handout that you can see here. There's a tiny URL at the bottom of the screen. I use this to help them get started and just like make sense of specific passages, but this may look different for your situation. You're welcome to use this if it's helpful to you. This simulation that we work with is very, very rich. The core takeaway is on these relationships. As blank increases, other things increase or decrease. We are not finding a slope. We are not defining terms like resistance, simply identifying a relationship. The main place where using the real equipment that you see on the bottom right would add nuance and complexity to the investigation is in the temperature conclusion. If you're short on time, you can skip this demo outright without missing all that much. The transfer task is the big assessment moment here. And depending on your circumstances, you may have an opportunity to differentiate based on how your students did on their transfer task. Um, for example, it's common practice at some schools for students to experience different activities depending on what understanding they've shown so far. If this is possible for you, you could use the changing fields reading to work with students who have struggled with the motors task the first time, while other students do something else. For example, this algebra in circuits extension is something that students who did well the first time could spend their time doing. This extension gets into Ohm's law and provides some interesting puzzles. With basically thinking of wires as resistors. So if your entire classroom can handle this algebra and circuits extension, I recommend it. I think it's a great use of time. But if you see it more as a challenge activity for differentiation, it works well that way too. In this lesson, we come up with a particle level mechanistic explanation for why we tend to lose energy to the surroundings. We also develop these relationships between length and width of a wire and energy loss. Um, in the algebra and circuits extension, we define the term resistance, um, but we don't actually use it elsewhere in the unit. Other terms we use in the reading include electric current, electron, alternating current, kinetic energy, and motor. Um, we reference this generator diagram to navigate into our investigation of the wires, and this diagram can be very helpful, perhaps too helpful, on the motor's transfer task. So I wouldn't recommend posting the generator diagram in your room as a poster. It could be very beneficial to have some examples from the fields reading posted on a poster so that students can refer to this while they're taking the transfer task. Tune in next video to see some details about lesson 7 and how we look at what actually happened and who was affected in Texas.